The last rays of sunlight bled across the platform like spilled molasses, staining the weathered boards the color of dried blood. A stagecoach thundered into the gathering dusk, its wheels spitting gravel against the ticket shack, and for one terrible moment, the youngest child, barely 4 and clutching a rag doll without a face, thought their mother might be inside. Instead, the coach simply swallowed the last passenger, slammed its door, and left behind only the echo of hoofbeats and a cloud of dust thick enough to choke hope itself. 7 children stood in that settling ash of departure. The oldest, a girl whose name had once mattered but now seemed as distant as the mother who'd vanished 3 towns back, wrapped her thin arms around her ragtag flock as Wyoming wind knifed through their threadbare coats. In her right fist, she clutched a flour sack that held their entire world. 3 dented tin cups that had served as everything from soup bowls to bathtubs, a harmonica cracked down the middle like her heart, and a piece of yellowed paper bearing words that would haunt her dreams until her hair turned silver. Take care of each other. The note read in trembling ink. I'm sorry. No signature. No last name for any of them. Just those 6 words written by a woman who'd once braided her daughter's hair with fingers that smelled of lavender water, now reduced to shaking script from a stranger's pen. The station agent emerged from his office like a vulture sensing carrion, his lantern swinging between the children's faces as he counted heads with growing alarm. 6 tickets purchased, 7 mouths to feed. His kindness evaporated faster than morning dew, replaced by the cold arithmetic of survival. Orphans don't ride for free, he muttered, herding them toward the stock pens where cattle load their evening chorus. You'll sleep with the horses tonight, and God help whoever wants you come morning. That night, as stars wheeled overhead like thrown diamonds, the girl pressed her cheek against cold iron rails and felt panic crystallize into something harder. Her youngest brother, snot-nosed Benji with his gap-toothed grin, whispered questions into her shoulder. Where's Ma? Why'd she leave us? Did we do something wrong? She answered with a lullaby their mother used to sing, each note scraped raw by the wind, every syllable soaked in the salt of her own tears. Dawn came painted in bruised purples and angry oranges, and with it rode a man on a chestnut gelding who smelled of leather and coffee and something that might have been salvation. Clay McAllister took one look at the fierce set of the girl's jaw, at the way she stood between her siblings and the world like a pint-sized guardian angel, and something shifted behind his weathered eyes. The wind hadn't let up for 3 days straight, driving tumbleweed through the busted fence like it was running from something too. On the porch of the half-burnt homestead sat a girl of maybe 16, hair the color of creek bed clay, arms wrapped around 2 younger boys whose names the frontier had already forgotten. Their mother's grave, still raw, lay 30 yards west beneath a crooked cedar cross. No stone, no dates, just a single hair ribbon of faded blue flapping against the splintered wood like a flag of surrender. The girl had driven it into the ground with her own fist when the preacher didn't come, because somebody had to mark the spot before the prairie swallowed every trace of her. Across the valley, the McKenna spread stretched wide as a promise, its ranch lights flickering against the early dusk like low stars that had given up on heaven. They said Calder McKenna rode out at dawn and didn't return until the sky bled violet, pushing both horse and man past what was sensible. He had a reputation for finishing things he started, branding irons, bar fights, marriages, yet one look at the black crepe on the cabin door told him this particular ending had slipped through his fingers. Inside, the tin coffee pot sat cold. The girl, nobody had bothered to give her a first name when she was born, let alone a last, held the youngest boy against her shoulder while the middle one curled on the floorboards like a kicked pup. Hunger had long since stopped announcing itself. It simply lived in them now, quiet as dust. She pressed her lips to the baby's fevered forehead, tasting salt and worry, and whispered the same lullaby their mother used to hum off-key. The words were threadbare, but the tune carried her back to a time when supper steamed on the table and laughter rode the air like barn swallows. Outside, a coyote called, its wavering note sliding down the scale until it sounded almost human. The girl answered in her mind, I'm still here. I'm still trying. Sometime in the night, the wind dropped, surrendering to a silence so absolute she could hear the creak of saddle leather on the ridge. A single rider broke the horizon line, shadow long against the moonlit grass. Calder McKenna drew rein at the gateless gap where the fence used to stand. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he took off his hat, letting his dark hair tumble free, and studied the little huddle of life on the porch. Lamplight from the doorway struck the silver conchos on his cuffs, turning them to tiny suns. At last he said, low and steady, You got family coming? The girl lifted her chin, eyes storm gray beneath soot-smudged lashes. We're what's left. 3 words dropped like spent cartridges, final and unafraid. Calder's gaze moved over the cabin's scorched walls, the empty corral, the cedar cross nodding in the night breeze. Something in his chest tightened, an old wound reopening without permission. He had buried a wife once. He recognized the look on this girl's face, the way grief had clawed out everything soft and left only flint. He swung down from the saddle, boots hitting dirt with a thud that sounded like a decision. Then you're riding out with me at first light, he said. McKee, nest don't leave kin to the wolves. The girl felt the words land like warm stones in her empty stomach. Kin. She hadn't realized how starved she was for the sound of it. Behind her the boys stirred, sensing the shift the way cattle sense weather. Calder stepped closer, moonlight carving the lines of his face into something carved from canyon walls. What do I call you? He asked. She hesitated, tasting the wind again, tasting the future. Whatever name you're willing to give me, she whispered. Dust devils twisted between the cedar posts the morning the stranger rode in. Sunlight, already merciless, glinted off the man's silver conchos and turned the sweat on his bay stallion into streaks of molten gold. I stood barefoot on the porch, a bucket of well water trembling in my hands, and watched him rein up slow, as though he feared the sound of hooves might break whatever fragile peace clung to the place. He swung down, boots stirring little flurries of red earth, and lifted his hat. Dark hair tumbled across his brow, sun-bleached at the tips like prairie grass in late summer. The first thing I noticed was the scar, pale, jagged, running from his left temple to the corner of his mouth, yet it didn't mar his face so much as tell a story I hadn't earned the right to hear. Behind me, the twins squatted in the doorway, wide-eyed as barn owls, their fingers laced through the hem of my skirt like lifelines. The man's gaze swept the sagging roof, the empty corrals, the single sway-backed mule grazing the far fence, and finally settled on me. When he spoke, his voice carried the low roll of distant thunder. Morning, miss. I'm Calder Hartwell. Your brother Jacob sent word you might need help getting this place through winter. Jacob. The name scraped across raw memory. My eldest brother, gone 3 months now, chasing wages up the Bozeman Trail, promising to send money, promising to send hope. I swallowed the sudden burn in my throat. We managed fine, I said, though the lie tasted bitter as alkali. Calder's eyes, storm cloud gray, softened, and for a heartbeat his silence spoke louder than any apology. He looped his reins over the hitching post. I don't doubt your grit, ma'am, but grit won't keep snow off the roof or venison in the smokehouse. Jacob figured I owed him a favor. Let me settle the debt. Behind me, little Matty tugged my skirt. He got a gun. The boy whispered, reverent as prayer. I glanced at the Colt riding Calder's hip, walnut handle worn smooth. A working man's tool, not a braggart's toy. Days slid by like water through a cracked canteen. Calder moved with quiet purpose, shoring up the barn's leaning wall, splitting stove-length pine, mending harness leather that had hung in tatters since Pa's last winter. Each night, he took his supper on the porch steps, plate balanced on one knee, hat tipped back to catch the stars. I found myself watching the way lantern light caught in the hollow of his throat when he swallowed coffee, the way Calouse, fingertips gentled around Lucy's rag doll when she toddled over to show him her treasure. One evening, thunderheads piled purple against the mountains. We stood in the corral together, easing a new gelding through his first saddling. The horse shied, nostrils flared, ears flat. Without thinking, I laid a hand on Calder's forearm, warm skin over iron muscle, and felt the tremor run through him. Not fear, something deeper. Recognition, maybe, of every wild thing that ever wanted to bolt yet stayed. "Easy," he murmured, not to the horse, but to me. Rain began to fall in sparse, heavy drops that smelled of sage and distant lightning. Water darkened his shirt until it clung to the sharp line of his shoulders. "You've carried this place alone too long." A crack of thunder rolled over us. In the sudden flare of white light, I saw his expression, raw, unguarded, as if the storm had peeled away every practiced layer. My heartbeat matched the drumming rain. For the first time since Jacob rode away, the emptiness inside me felt less like a wound and more like a doorway. Lightning forked across the ridge, illuminating the ranch in stark silver. Every broken board, every blooming weed, every small heart still beating under this bruised sky. Calder's hand covered mine where it rested on the fence rail. His calluses rasped against my skin, a promise written in flesh instead of words. Wind whipped my hair across my face, hiding the tears I hadn't realized were falling. Dust devils spiraled across the yard like dancers who'd forgotten the music, and Cassie watched them from the shadow of the bunkhouse porch, her bare toes curled over sun-warmed pine. 3 days had passed since Jonah Calhoun had carried her out of the line cabin. 3 nights since she'd woken beneath a quilt that smelled of cedar soap and horses. Each morning she'd expected him to change his mind, expected the same quick dismissal she'd known all her life. But the rancher only nodded when their eyes met, as if keeping a stray girl was the most natural thing in the world. Inside the kitchen, the clatter of pans told her the boys were up. Luke and Micah, all elbows and questions, had already claimed the bench closest to the stove, their freckled faces glowing in the lamplight. They still carried the hollow look of children who'd learned early that nothing stays, yet they laughed when Jonah told stories about cattle that could count and coyotes that filed their teeth. Cassie listened from the doorway, arms folded tight across her ribs. Laughter felt foreign on her tongue, a language she hadn't spoken since Mama died, but the sound of it in this house soaked into her like summer rain on cracked earth. Jonah glanced up, spoon poised above the skillet. "Morning, Starlight," he said, the nickname soft as butter. She'd asked the first night why he called her that. He'd answered that the sky over New Mexico was too big for a girl with no name, so he'd given her one borrowed from the clearest thing he knew. The word still startled her every time, a small explosion of belonging. Outside, the Appaloosa mare named Mercy waited at the corral fence, ears pricked toward the sunrise. Jonah had promised Cassie her own mount once she proved she could sit a saddle without fear. Yesterday, she'd climbed the fence rails and laid a tentative hand on Mercy's neck, felt the ripple of muscle and the pulse beneath velvet skin. The horse had turned liquid brown eyes on her, unalarmed, as though recognizing another creature who'd once been broken. Jonah appeared beside her, coffee steaming in a battered tin cup. "You ready to learn her language today?" The question carried no weight of expectation, only open sky. Cassie's heart stumbled. She'd followed mule trains and cooking fires her whole life, but no one had ever offered to teach her something that belonged to her alone. They worked the mare in the round pen until noon, Jonah's voice low, patient, while the sun climbed and the shadows shortened. He showed Cassie how to ask for flexion with just a fingertip on the rein, how to speak through the shift of her hips. When Mercy finally dropped her head and blew out a long, contented breath, Cassie felt something inside her own chest unclench. She looked up and found Jonah watching her, hat brim hiding his eyes, but not the smile that lifted one corner of his mouth. Pride felt warm, like whiskey slipping down your throat on a cold night. In the afternoon, thunderheads stacked against the mountains, purple as bruises. Jonah rode out to check the yearlings in the high pasture, leaving Cassie to help the boys mend fence. Storm scent rode the wind, metallic and sharp. Luke handed her wire cutters. Micah offered a pair of gloves still too big. Together, they wrestled cedar posts into place while lightning stitched silver threads across the horizon. When the first fat drops fell, they ran for the barn, breathless and laughing, rain plastering hair to foreheads. Cassie's laughter surprised her again, bright as spangles on water. In the dim light of the barn, surrounded by the smell of hay and horses and possibility, she realized the ache in her chest had changed shape. It no longer felt like hunger. It felt like the moment before music begins, taut and trembling and alive. Jonah found them there at dusk, rain dripping from his slicker. He carried a branding iron fresh from the forge, Calhoun C reversed, and set it glowing against a pine board. "Time you three carried my name," he said. "Not because you owe me, but because names take root where love gives them room." The sun cracked open like an egg across the high plateau, spilling gold over the cedar ridge and turning the horses into moving bronze. Wyatt stood at the corral rails, one boot on the lowest rail, one hand shading his eyes as the herd thundered past. Behind him, on the porch of the old line shack, the girl, his girl now. He caught himself thinking, and the words stung like a brand, balanced a chipped enamel basin of W. Ate her for the youngest of her brothers. She had rolled her sleeves past her elbows, and the wind caught the loose cotton, so that for a moment she looked winged, a fallen angel learning how to be mortal. He had given her a name 2 nights ago, drawing it from the night air like a secret. "Cassidy," he'd said, testing the weight against his tongue. "It suits you." She had answered with a small, surprised nod that almost passed for a bow, then turned away so he wouldn't see her eyes shining. Today, the name felt heavier, stitched onto her skin and into his heartbeat, and every time he said it, he felt the rope of responsibility cinch tighter around his ribs. Inside the shack, her 2 small brothers slept in the loft like a pair of dreaming pups. Outside, the middle boy, Ezra, all elbows and resentment, scuffed gravel with the toe of one boot, watching Wyatt the way a coyote watches a trap. The boy had not yet forgiven him for the night ride when Wyatt had carried Cassidy across his saddle, unconscious and fever-flushed, leaving the others no choice but to follow on foot. Ezra's pride was a raw wound, and Wyatt could smell it like blood on the wind. The memory of that ride still pulsed behind Wyatt's eyes. He had wrapped her in his coat, her hair damp against his throat, whispering, "Stay with me," though he knew she couldn't hear. Each hoof ball had echoed inside his chest like a drumbeat counting down to something neither of them had dared name. When they reached the shack at dawn, the older boys had collapsed on the threshold, but Cassidy had stirred, fingers closing around his wrist as if she had always belonged there. Now she descended the porch steps carrying a tin cup of chicory coffee. Steam curled from the rim like morning prayer. She offered it without a word, and when their fingers brushed, a spark traveled from her skin to his, bright enough to light the whole valley. He drank, tasting cedar smoke and the faint sweetness of her breath lingering on the rim. Beyond the corral, thunder rumbled where no clouds gathered. Horses lifted their heads in unison, ears pricked toward the west. Wyatt followed their gaze and saw the thin line of dust rising along the stage road. A rider, fast and alone. His stomach tightened. Only one man he knew pushed a horse that hard across open range without caring who saw. Cassidy saw it too. The cup slipped from her fingers and clanged against the boards, brown liquid soaking into the thirsty wood. She didn't move to retrieve it. Instead, she reached for the youngest boy, drew him close, and stared at the horizon as if she could read the rider's intent in the swirl of dust. Wyatt stepped off the rail. The leather of his holster creaked when he adjusted it, a small sound that nevertheless cracked the morning like a warning shot. He felt the old anger uncoil inside him, the same cold fury that had driven him from his father's house years ago, the same fury that had kept him alive alone on the range. But now it was raw, peepedy around something softer, something that had her dark eyes, and a name that tasted like sunrise on his lips. He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that felt like a vow. "Get the boys inside," he said. His voice carried the calm of deep water, but underneath it roared a river neither of them could cross alone. The storm that swallowed the valley that night had teeth. Lightning unraveled across the jagged ridge like white-hot wire, and the wind clawed at every cedar shingle on the old Forester bunkhouse. Inside, the kerosene lamp on the scarred kitchen table trembled with each boom of thunder, throwing long shadows over 5 small faces and one grown man who suddenly understood the weight of a single promise. Clay Forester had sworn to keep these children safe, but the sky sounded like it was arguing. Mara, no longer the anonymous girl who had stepped off the orphan train, sat on a stool near the cook stove, her fingers laced through the handles of a chipped enamel mug. Steam curled around her cheeks, softening the sharp line of the scar she'd carried since Denver. She watched Clay move from window to window, barring shutters with the same steady certainty he used to gentle a skittish cold. Every clatter of the hammer was a heartbeat she hadn't known she possessed. Behind her, little Ruthie whimpered, burrowing deeper into the quilt Clay's mother had pieced from old cattle drive shirts. Noah, the oldest of the siblings, stood guard at the door, shoulders squared the way Clay had taught him, though his knuckles blanched white against the rifle he would never fire. Outside, the rain turned to hail, drumming a war song against the tin roof. Mara could feel the story of all her yesterdays trying to claw its way back in. The hunger, the cold depot benches, the echoing absence of anyone who'd ever cared whether she breathed. She set the mug aside, stood, and crossed the room. Clay turned at the brush of her fingertips on his sleeve. The lamplight revealed the exhaustion he rarely let show, but the set of his jaw never wavered. "Storm's riding low," he said, voice low enough that only she could hear. "Creek'll be over its banks inside an hour. I need to move the horses to higher ground." Mara's pulse skipped. She pictured the chestnut mare heavy with foal, the new calves still wobbling on stick legs. She pictured Clay alone out there, a single lantern against the darkness. Without thinking, she reached for the slicker hanging on the peg beside the door. "Then I'm coming with you." Clay's gaze flicked to the children, then back to her. "I can't ask that." "You didn't," she answered, and slipped the oilskin over her shoulders like armor. Minutes later, they plunged into the night, the wind slapping them with sheets of ice-cold rain. Clay's lantern guttered but held, casting a halo that danced over churned mud and thrashing sagebrush. They fought their way to the lower pasture, where the herd huddled in terrified knots. Mara's boots sank past the ankles, but she kept moving, calling to the animals in the same calm tone Clay used on her when nightmares came. One by one, the horses responded, ears pricked toward the sound of her voice. She felt the moment the chestnut mare nuzzled her palm, warm, alive, trusting, and something inside her chest that had been frozen since childhood began to thaw. By the time they reached the ridge trail, the creek had become a roaring monster, tearing at its banks with foam-flecked fury. Clay's lantern finally surrendered to the gale. Darkness swallowed them whole. Yet Mara did not falter. She pressed her hand to the mare's neck and felt the thunder of both their hearts. Over the storm she heard Clay shout her name, the first time he'd ever said it without hesitation, as if it had always belonged on his tongue. Lightning flared, illuminating the slope above the barn. A wall of water bore down, uprooting cottonwoods like matchsticks. There was no time to outrun it. Clay grabbed her wrist, yanked her toward a jut of granite she hadn't seen. They wedged themselves into the crevice with the mare between them, shielding the animal's head as the flood roared past. Spray soaked them to the bone, but the rock held. In that cramped hollow, with the storm raging inches away, Mara understood the simplest truth she had ever known. Home wasn't a name on a deed or a bloodline traced in ink. It was the steady beat of Clay's pulse beneath her fingertips, the way he angled his body to block the worst of the spray, the unspoken vow that neither of them would let go. The prairie wind no longer carried sorrow through the cottonwoods. It carried music instead. Jeb's fiddle crooned a love song that had waited 30 years for lyrics, and every note stitched the ranch back together. Sarah stood barefoot on the porch boards he'd planed smooth for her, the hem of the blue dress she'd sewn from his mother's wedding quilt brushing her ankles. When she smiled, the scar along her jaw, the last trace of the night she'd been nameless and terrified, curved like a secret only the two of them understood. Behind her, the four youngest McKenna kids chased fireflies across the yard, their laughter bright as new pennies. They were hers now in every way that mattered. The adoption papers lay signed and folded in the cedar box beneath their bed. Clay, the oldest boy, leaned against the porch rail, nearly a man, his father's Colt strapped to his hip, and the future burning steady in his eyes. He'd asked Jeb to teach him the brand's running iron tomorrow. The Circle Heart would ride on long after all of them. Jeb set the fiddle aside and crossed the boards as if crossing the last mile of a long, hard trail. Moonlight poured silver across his shoulders, turning his weather-creased shirt into armor of light. When he reached Sarah, he didn't speak. Words had never been his strength. Instead, he lifted her left hand and brushed his thumb across the simple gold band he'd driven 3 days to Cheyenne to buy. Ring caught the moon and flung it back like a promise. "McKenna fits you," he murmured, voice rough as river gravel. "Fits you better than any name I ever heard." Her answer came on a breath that tasted of sage and hope. "It fits because you gave it soul." From the bunkhouse, the hands began pounding a slow rhythm on tin plates, cowboy wedding bells, raw and joyful. Horses nickered in the corral, restless with the celebration, and over by the cook fire, old Cookie lifted his battered harmonica to join the fiddle's refrain. The music swelled, spilled across the dark, and somewhere up on the ridge a lone coyote lifted its voice to harmonize. Sarah stepped down into the yard, skirts swaying, and held out her hands to the children. They formed a ring around her and Jeb, boots scuffing dust into clouds of gold. Round and round they turned, a spinning constellation of denim and calico, until even the stars above the Rockies leaned closer to watch. In the center of the dance, Jeb caught her close, palm steady against the small of her back. "I used to think a man's legacy was land and cattle," he said against her ear. "Turns out it's this, your heartbeat next to mine." Sarah pressed her cheek to his shoulder, feeling the rhythm of his life through flannel and skin. "Then our legacy is endless," she whispered, "because every child here carries it." One by one, the lanterns blinked out, surrendering the night to moonlight and music. The dancers slowed, breathless, until only Jeb and Sarah remained turning beneath the sky's dark dome. Above them, the North Star burned like a watchful guardian, fixed, unwavering, eternal. Jeb bent to kiss her, slow and reverent, tasting salt tears and laughter and tomorrow all at once. When they drew apart, the ranch lay quiet except for the soft stamp of horses and the distant hush of the river. He tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear, the gesture as familiar now as breathing. "Let's go home," he said. Home. Not the weathered house behind them, not even the sweep of grass that carried their brand, but the circle of their arms, the name they shared, the children breathing softly in the bunkhouse. Sarah slipped her hand into his, and together they walked toward the porch light glowing like a small, defiant star against the vast western dark. Somewhere in the distance, a night bird called once, clear, sure, answered by another. The sound lingered over the sleeping land like a blessing. The biscuit tin had grown too small for all the years she'd carried it. On the morning of her 18th birthday, Ellie McAllister walked to the cottonwood grove where the first green leaves whispered secrets to the wind. She'd spent half the night writing one final letter, different from the hundreds before it, because this one had an address. Clay had given her the deed to 40 acres along Willow Creek, the prettiest stretch of bottomland this side of the mountains. "Your name's on the paper now," he'd said, his voice, gruff with emotion that embarrassed them both. "Been yours for years. Just needed ink to make it official." She pressed her palm against the smooth bark of the tallest tree, feeling the pulse of sap beneath. The letters rustled in her hands like captured butterflies. One by one, she tucked them into the hollow where a woodpecker had carved a perfect niche. When the last letters settled into place, she felt something shift inside her chest, Not the sharp pain she'd carried since that dusty platform, but the soft exhale of something finally complete. Benji would start the fall term at the territorial school, funded by money she'd earned breaking horses no man wanted to ride. The twins had apprenticeships waiting in town. Little Sarah had already claimed the blue bedroom in the main house, where she'd grow up knowing nothing but the solid certainty of belonging. Clay appeared at the edge of the grove, his graying hair catching the sunlight like polished silver. He didn't speak, just extended his hand the same way he had 10 years ago on that station platform. This time, when Ellie took it, her fingers weren't trembling. They walked back toward the ranch house together, past the bunkhouse door where 7 notches had become 8, her name carved deep beside the others, McAllister written in letters that would outlast them both. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and promise across the valley. Somewhere in the distance, cattle called to their calves, and the M-Bar-M brand glowed red against the barn wall in the morning light. Ellie paused at the fence where she'd learned to swing an axe, to rope and ride and believe in tomorrows. She wasn't the girl left behind anymore. She was Ellie McAllister, rancher, sister, daughter of a man who taught her that family wasn't just blood and bone. It was the people who chose to stay, who carved your name in wood when you had none, who made you earn their name until it fit like skin. The stagecoach that had rolled away into dusk all those years ago had carried more than her mother. It had carried a life that might have been. But here, beneath the vast Wyoming sky she'd once feared, Ellie had built something stronger than regret. She'd built a home where 7 shadows had become 7 souls, where borrowed names became legacies, and where love had proven itself deeper than any goodbye.